January 2015, Qatar Airways became the launch customer for the Airbus A350-900, followed by the bigger 1000 variant 3 years later. They built their entire brand around these aircraft, marketing them as the jewel of their premium product. But in 2021, Qatar Airways shocked the industry by grounding 13 of its A350s, citing serious airworthiness concerns and demanding millions in compensation, even though the aircraft were deemed perfectly safe by Airbus and the EASA. What started as a chipped paint issue had exploded into the most extraordinary corporate war the aviation industry has ever witnessed. But what made this so explosive was the allegation about safety was never the real issue. Instead, critics argued it was Qatar's tactic to bully Airbus into submission and meet its demands. But what unraveled was exactly the opposite of what Qatar Airways had expected. Airbus hit back ruthlessly by cancelling $20 billion worth of orders, and then deployed the nuclear option, invoking a contractual clause that didn't just punish Qatar, it obliterated their entire fleet strategy for years to come. By the time Qatar Airways realized that they'd just made a catastrophic miscalculation, it was too late. And when it was all over, the damage was staggering, one that would cost Qatar hundreds of millions of dollars, force them to resurrect aircraft they swore they'd never fly again, and ultimately end the career of their legendary CEO. This is how a tiny paint chip issue escalated into one of the biggest corporate wars in aviation. When Qatar Airways took delivery of its first Airbus A350-900 in January 2015, the moment was historic. The Gulf carrier had just become the launch customer for what would become one of the most advanced commercial aircraft ever built. A few years later, they repeated the feat, becoming the launch customer for the larger A350-1000 variant as well. On paper, it was a partnership destined for greatness. Qatar Airways would go on to operate the world's second-largest A350 fleet, deploying these sleek, fuel-efficient jets across an impressive network of long and medium-haul routes spanning every continent. The relationship between Qatar Airways and Airbus appeared unshakable. After all, Qatar had staked its reputation on these aircraft, marketing them as the backbone of its premium product. And for good reason, the A350 represented everything a modern airline could want. Cutting-edge technology, exceptional fuel efficiency, and the kind of passenger comfort that helped Qatar Airways win the coveted Skytrax World's Best Airline Award year after year. Behind the glossy press releases and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, however, trouble was brewing. What started as a minor quality concern would eventually explode into one of the most extraordinary corporate battles the aviation industry has ever witnessed. Just a year into operating the A350, Qatar Airways began noticing something troubling. The paint on their brand new aircraft wasn't holding up as expected. Patches were chipping, surfaces were degrading, and the pristine livery that symbolized their premium brand was starting to look worn. Qatar wasn't alone in this observation. 5 other A350 operators reported similar issues to Airbus around the same time. Airbus acknowledged the complaints and responded as any manufacturer would, with aircraft under warranty. They worked with affected airlines to repaint damaged sections and implemented fixes where needed. For the next few years, this collaborative approach largely kept the problem under control, and the partnerships continued without major incident. Then 2020 arrived, and everything changed. By the end of that year, Qatar Airways was preparing for one of the biggest events in the nation's history, hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2022. As part of this celebration, one of their A350 was sent to Shannon, Ireland, for a special transformation, stripping the existing livery and applying a commemorative World Cup paint scheme. When technicians began removing the old paint, they were baffled. The damage wasn't merely superficial. The deterioration extended beyond the paint layers and had affected the underlying metallic mesh embedded between the carbon fiber structure and the exterior coating, which served a critical safety function. Qatar Airways immediately raised red flags with Airbus, arguing that this degradation potentially represented a serious airworthiness concern, not merely an aesthetic problem. The stakes had suddenly escalated from a minor warranty issue to a potential safety crisis. To understand why this discovery alarmed Qatar Airways, we need to examine what makes the A350 fundamentally different from previous generation aircraft. The A350 represented a revolutionary leap in aircraft construction, being among the first commercial airliners built predominantly from carbon fiber composite materials, rather than traditional aluminum. Carbon fiber composites behave very differently from aluminum in crucial ways. Aluminum expands and contracts predictably with temperature changes, whereas carbon fiber structures remain relatively dimensionally stable. The exterior paint, on the other hand, still expands and contracts with temperature, and this mismatch in thermal properties creates adhesion challenges, requiring specially formulated primers to bond the paint reliably to composite surfaces. The more critical difference involves electrical conductivity and lightning strike protection. When lightning hits a conventional aluminum airframe, current flows harmlessly across the surface and exits at another point, usually on the wings or tail, leaving only tiny entry and exit marks with minimal damage. Carbon fiber, while somewhat conductive, cannot do this as effectively. Its higher electrical resistance generates more heat, risking structural damage. Airbus addressed this by embedding a thin metallic mesh in all carbon composite sections, replicating aluminum's lightning protection and safely conducting energy across the aircraft's surface. This is precisely where Qatar Airways identified their concern. If this protective mesh was degrading or separating from the composite structure, could it still perform its essential safety function? Airbus took these concerns seriously and immediately engaged with EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, that serves as the regulatory authority for Airbus aircraft. Together, they conducted a comprehensive investigation into the paint and mesh degradation observed on Qatar's A350 fleet. Their conclusion? The issue was purely cosmetic. While the appearance wasn't acceptable and Airbus needed to resolve the paint adhesion problems, the safety margins built into the lightning protection system meant the aircraft remained completely airworthy. Aviation authorities worldwide that examined the issue reached identical conclusions. This did not constitute a flight safety concern. Moreover, Airbus committed to working collaboratively with Qatar Airways to develop solutions, just as they had done successfully with other operators experiencing similar but less severe paint issues. Qatar Airways, however, rejected this assessment entirely. Rather than accepting Airbus's offer to work together toward a solution, they took a dramatically different approach. They demanded a comprehensive root cause analysis, insisted on compensation, and made a threat that would escalate this dispute beyond anyone's imagination. They would refuse the delivery of new A350 aircraft until their concerns were fully addressed. To understand why Qatar Airways took such an aggressive stance, we need to examine its corporate culture and leadership philosophy. Under former CEO Akbar al-Bakr, the airline built a reputation for an uncompromising pursuit of perfection. That obsessive attention to detail had elevated Qatar Airways into the top tier of global carriers. But that same perfectionism came with a cost. The airline's management approach had become notorious within the industry for policies that many considered excessive. For instance, Qatar's cabin crew faced a strict curfew, which required them to remain in company-provided housing between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. daily. They also couldn't leave their accommodations for 12 hours before any flying duty. Social media policies were draconian. Crew members risked serious consequences for any posts deemed inappropriate, and repeated reports of arbitrary terminations and harsh disciplinary actions fostered a culture of fear among staff. But this exacting approach wasn't limited to employees. According to industry sources, Qatar Airways routinely rejected aircraft deliveries over the most minute imperfections. Issues as trivial as carpet appearance in the cabin. Demanding perfection from a $300 million aircraft purchase might seem reasonable, but the frequency and nature of these rejections had created ongoing friction with Airbus over the years. Airbus had accepted this as the cost of doing business with a demanding customer, but when Qatar began publicly questioning the airworthiness of its aircraft based on a cosmetic issue, however, Airbus was furious. Airbus firmly rejected Qatar Airways' characterization of the paint issue as a safety concern and refused to provide the compensation being demanded. The manufacturer stood behind the exhaustive safety analysis conducted by EASA and aviation authorities worldwide. The evidence was clear. This remained a cosmetic issue that Airbus was committed to resolving, but it did not compromise airworthiness. Qatar Airways wasn't ready to back down. In what many observers saw as an extraordinary escalation, Qatar Airways, working with the Qatar Civil Aviation Authority, grounded 13 A350 aircraft in August 2021. They cited serious airworthiness concerns, despite the absence of concrete evidence or support from any other global aviation authority. This was no longer just a business dispute. This was an attempt by Qatar to force Airbus into meeting its demands. For Airbus, this represented a line being crossed. The manufacturer was outraged by how Qatar Airways and the Qatari regulator handled the situation. By grounding these aircraft and publicly questioning their airworthiness, Qatar was not only jeopardizing the entire A350 program, a multi-billion-dollar project decades in the making, but also Airbus's reputation for safety, potentially misleading other airlines around the world. Airbus didn't hold back its contempt. The company pointed out how remarkably convenient it was that Qatar needed to ground these aircraft at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when airlines worldwide were already desperately parking excess capacity anyway. Airbus even suggested that Qatar Airways might have influenced its own civil aviation authority to ground the aircraft for financial advantage, allowing the airline to reduce capacity during the pandemic while simultaneously building a case for compensation. The gloves were now completely off. But Qatar wasn't finished yet. In January 2022, Qatar Airways launched its most aggressive move yet by filing a massive lawsuit against Airbus in British courts. They demanded $600 million in damages, plus an additional $4 million for every single day that each grounded aircraft remained out of service. With the clock ticking on multiple aircraft, this penalty was accumulating at an extraordinary rate, potentially adding hundreds of millions to the claim. Qatar Airways was attempting to use the legal system to force Airbus into submission, betting that the European manufacturer would rather settle than face a prolonged, expensive, and potentially reputation-damaging court battle. But they had seriously miscalculated Airbus's willingness to fight back. And that's exactly what happened. Airbus responded with devastating force. They immediately filed a countersuit against Qatar Airways for $220 million, arguing that the airline had breached its contractual obligations by refusing to accept delivery of newly manufactured A350 aircraft. Airbus didn't stop there. Airbus cancelled all 19 remaining A350 aircraft still on Qatar Airways' order book. These weren't just future orders. These were aircraft either already built or in various stages of production, specifically configured for Qatar Airways. Yet Airbus proceeded anyway, sending an unmistakable message. They would rather absorb significant financial losses than be pushed around. But the final blow was yet to come. Airbus then deployed what can only be described as the nuclear option in aircraft industry disputes. They cancelled Qatar Airways' entire order for 50 A321neo aircraft, invoking a cross-default clause embedded in their contracts. This provision stated that if either party materially breached one contract, the other party could terminate separate contracts as well. This cancellation was devastating for Qatar Airways' future planning. The airline had counted on these A321neo aircraft to expand its short and medium-haul operations. These weren't just any aircraft orders. They represented Qatar's strategic plan for network growth over the coming years. Moreover, the A321neo was experiencing unprecedented demand, with a backlog approaching 5,000 aircraft at the time. As a result, delivery slots for this aircraft were precious commodities, forcing new buyers to wait years for delivery. This was a catastrophic blow for Qatar Airways. So the airline immediately challenged Airbus's decision in UK courts, specifically requesting that the A321neo cancellation be treated as a separate contractual matter, not subject to cross-default provisions. Simultaneously, they approached Boeing with what would become one of the fastest major aircraft deals in history. Within just over a week of Airbus's A321neo cancellation, Qatar Airways announced an order for 25 Boeing 737 MAX 10 aircraft, with options for 25 more. But the bitter irony was impossible to ignore. Qatar Airways, which had grounded perfectly airworthy A350s over unsubstantiated safety concerns, was now ordering the 737 MAX, an aircraft that had been involved in 2 catastrophic crashes that claimed the lives of 346 people and had only recently returned to service after a lengthy grounding. Qatar's pivot to the MAX seemed almost hypocritical given their stance on the A350's safety. These headline-grabbing legal and commercial battles were just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, Qatar Airways was facing an operational nightmare, entirely of its own making. When Qatar initially refused delivery of new A350s and subsequently grounded 13 aircraft, they apparently assumed this situation would resolve quickly. They hoped Airbus would offer compensation to preserve the relationship with such an important customer. Perhaps public pressure would force Airbus to compromise. Instead, when Airbus refused to budge, it left Qatar in a critical situation. You see, Qatar was set to host the FIFA World Cup in November 2022, which was just months away. This was one of the most prestigious sporting events on the planet, expected to bring millions of visitors to Doha. Qatar Airways needed maximum capacity to handle this unprecedented surge in demand. Yet the very aircraft designed to manage this influx were sitting idle on the tarmac, grounded not by safety concerns, but by a corporate ego battle. Qatar Airways had no choice but to scramble for alternatives, and none of them would be easy or cheap. First, they turned to their aging Airbus A330 fleet. Qatar Airways once operated nearly 50 of these aircraft, but they had been systematically retiring them since before the pandemic, replacing them with the newer, more efficient A350s. By the time the Airbus dispute erupted, about half of the A330 fleet had already been retired, with many placed in long-term storage. Now suddenly, these retired aircraft needed to come back to life. But here's what most people don't understand about aircraft storage. It's not like parking a car in your garage. When airlines mothball aircraft, they undergo extensive preservation procedures. Fuel systems are drained and treated. Hydraulic fluids are replaced with protective substitutes, engines are carefully preserved, and every system is prepared for extended dormancy. Reversing this process is extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive. Every system must be meticulously inspected, fluids replaced, miles of wiring checked for deterioration, hydraulic lines tested, engines brought back to operational status, and then comprehensive test flights are conducted. For a wide-body aircraft like the A330, this process costs millions of dollars per aircraft and takes weeks or months. Qatar Airways had to repeat this painful, expensive process for 14 A330s, resulting in an enormous financial and operational burden. If resurrecting the A330 fleet was expensive, what came next was almost painful in its irony. Qatar Airways decided to return their entire fleet of 10 Airbus A380s to service aircraft they had retired during the pandemic, with no intention of ever flying them again. The backstory makes this decision particularly humiliating. Qatar Airways had shocked the aviation world in 2019 by announcing plans to retire these aircraft after just 5 years of service, an absurdly young age for airframes that are designed to operate for 25 to 30 years. Former CEO Akbar al-Bakr had publicly and repeatedly stated that purchasing the A380 was Qatar Airways' biggest mistake. He questioned the aircraft's usefulness and efficiency, suggesting the airline would never fly them again. Yet here was Qatar Airways forced to eat those words entirely. With no resolution to their self-created Airbus dispute and the World Cup approaching, they had no alternative. The airline committed enormous resources to returning all 10 A380s to service, a process even more complex and expensive than reactivating the A330s, given the A380's unprecedented size and system complexity. The airline that thought it was engaging in a simple negotiating tactic had instead backed itself into a catastrophically expensive corner. As the legal battle progressed through British courts, Qatar Airways faced increasingly unfavourable rulings. In a series of decisions that must have felt like hammer blows, the court sided decisively with Airbus. The court ruled that the contracts were indeed covered by the cross-default clause, and that Qatar Airways' refusal to accept A350 deliveries constituted a valid basis for cancelling the A321neo order. Airbus was fully within its rights to offer Qatar's production slots to other customers. Then came the moment of truth. On January 20th, 2023, the court ordered Qatar Airways to provide concrete evidence justifying its original decision to ground the A350 fleet. Qatar had consistently argued that their hand had been forced by the Qatar Civil Aviation Authority's safety concerns. Now, they needed to produce the evidence that supported this unprecedented regulatory action. But just 11 days later, on February 1st, 2023, a stunning announcement emerged. Airbus and Qatar Airways had reached a confidential settlement agreement. The terms of the settlement were not publicly disclosed, but the timing speaks volumes. Qatar Airways clearly didn't have the evidence they needed. Faced with a court order to produce concrete proof justifying their safety claims, they chose to settle instead, clearly suggesting their case wouldn't survive judicial scrutiny. What followed revealed the extent of Qatar's defeat. Airbus agreed to reinstate the cancelled orders for both A350s and A321neos, but on drastically altered terms. Deliveries that were originally scheduled to begin in 2023 would now not commence until 2026, a 3-year delay. For an airline that had been desperate for these aircraft to support its expansion plans, this delay was devastating. For Qatar Airways and Qatar as a nation, this entire saga represented a humiliating public defeat. The consequences reached the highest levels of Qatar Airways leadership. Akbar al-Bakr, the controversial CEO who had built the airline into a premium global brand, resigned from his position. The new CEO promptly announced a commitment to bringing a culture of trust and empowerment to Qatar Airways, a clear signal that the old ways were being left behind. For Qatar Airways, the lesson was expensive and painful. Prestige battles in business rarely end well. Sometimes the best victory is knowing when to compromise before things spiral out of control. By the time they learned that lesson, it had already cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, years of operational headaches, and the job of their former CEO.